embedded vulnerabilities and good stuff I've done with embedded systems has been around stuff that I had access to. Now, that's not to say I can't get it. So, control systems people often think, well, I get this control systems and nobody's going to hack it because no one really knows about it. I mean, I can pretend to be anyone and call them up and obtain that particular hardware. That's not the problem. Of course, you can send me free stuff and I'll look at the security of it. No one's taken me up on that offer yet. I don't know why. So the other thing I wanted to prove, now that we've gone through power, money, and stealth, is that these embedded systems and embedded computers are everywhere. And the best place I thought to look was a place called wiggle.net. Has anyone heard of wiggle.net? Yeah, it's a global thing, which I think is awesome. And people go around and they essentially war drive, except now you can do that with your Android phone. There's an app. Your Android phone goes around, you just put it in your pocket, and you're war driving or walking, and you're picking up all the open wireless access points, and you're uploading your data to wiggle.net. That's awesome. So wiggle.net produces some statistics. So statistically, if I wanted to take over the world and target a particular embedded systems made by a manufacturer, because they've listed out the manufacturers, even just by SSID, I know that there's approximately 1.9 million Linksys routers out there that are open wireless routers that are ripe for the picking. So now I can strategically target by vendor and know which vendors, roughly, are the ones that I want to target. Not only that, but the fact that there are millions of these things out there proves to me that it's everywhere. If you don't believe me, I'll show you a map. Okay, that's Boston. That's fine. That's like the other side of the pond. That's Brussels. All of the red and green mean, these are all open wireless access points. The green means it has good signal and good bandwidth, and the red means it has okay bandwidth. So apparently you guys have okay bandwidth over here. But you've got a lot of open wireless access points, which proves my theory of that these things are everywhere. Now I have to prove that they're vulnerable, that people can break into these embedded systems and do evil things with them. So there was some previous research. I'm not the first person to go forth and do this research, so I've done a little bit of homework and found that researchers scanned the internet before Bob and found 21,000 vulnerable routers, and their administrative interfaces were viewable from anywhere in the world, and they failed to change the manufacturer's default password. Well, there's problem number one with the manufacturers and the industry in general. Why is there a concept of a default password? And you'll see how we can use this to gain potentially money, power, and do it stealthily. So the researchers provided the ISPs. So these, a lot of the manufacturers that were found to be vulnerable were actually ISPs. And the ISPs hand you a device. The device has an Ethernet. It has some kind of coax connection. So it's a wireless access point. It's everything all in one. So it's your cable DSL router, your Linksys router, and they merged them together. And many ISPs give these devices to their subscribers, and they try to manage them themselves. So the ISPs were given the findings of the research from Columbia University that found 21,000 vulnerable systems, and said that they should do something to protect their customers. Do you think this is true? No. So I was reading another article that said, well, in the case of Time Warner, this is a story where someone found that if you disable JavaScript and browse to the router, that you can just log into the router and be an administrator. And you'll see a lot of these things putting the default username and password inside of the web page that you log into. So the person who found this extremely easy to exploit vulnerability that grants you administrative access to the routers of Time Warner cable subscribers, Time Warner said, well, we can't really do anything about it. If you read a little further in the article, it says Time Warner has not just the model that was vulnerable, but that's just a small portion of the 14 million devices that we have out there. And oh, by the way, chances are if you find a vulnerability in them, they can't do anything about it. Now, for world domination, that's awesome. For the rest of the world, that sucks. So I started talking with Bob and thought, well, there's 14 million devices out there just from Time Warner alone. What if Bob started doing some scanning of the internet to look for these devices? And maybe Bob used Google or Shodan to find the most popular ISPs and start targeting some of these ISPs and seeing which model routers they're running. Maybe I use Aaron to discover their full IP address ranges dedicated to those ISPs and scan just those blocks with Nmap on port 80 to find the web administrative interfaces on these routers and manually poke through the results and see what I find. Or if Bob is even more evil, automate something to find vulnerabilities, exploit them, and upload custom configurations or firmware. That's the more evil attack that I'm really concerned about. So Bob and I did this research, and we're here telling you about it to make the world a better place. I don't think everyone has the same goals. If you scan the internet, you'll find that. I totally agree. It's totally wrong. And there are a lot of ISPs that do block it, but when you start looking globally around the world, you find that they're open. And that's part of my plea to these ISPs is to block port 80. So it's an excellent point. Correct. Correct. Yeah. Or disable the administrative interface for the ISPs that run their own or manage their own embedded systems. Absolutely. No, it's a good point. And that's where I hope we get to. Right? It's an easy thing. Why we're doing it, I don't know. I think it's an education thing. So, and that's part of what, at the end of the presentation, I'll talk about a site where, I want to help build essentially a community that's saying, hey, let's put a little more security. And it's not like we're asking them to educate users or do something hard. We're asking them to do things like turn off a web interface. So I went out and found some vulnerabilities with Bob's help, and found some tons of fail on the internet with respect to wireless routers, printers, and I did a little bit with the Roku. So here's where Shodan comes handy. Let's say I've done some research into a Huawei router, and I have a vulnerability for a Huawei router. And I want to find an ISP that's running the Huawei router and exposing it to the world via the web administrative interface. I do a search for that on Shodan. I see that Colombia is a pretty popular country to run this particular kind of router. Likely, the ISP in Colombia will run this kind of router and maybe leave it, it has left it open because Shodan found it. I take this IP address, I figure out which ISP is running this particular brand of router, and that's the one that I scan. So how do I scan it? You can scan it with Nmap. This is actually a pretty well-tuned version of Nmap command, rather. I'm using version light. I'm saying only show me the open ports, and I'm doing some other Nmap goodness. And I can scan, roughly 2 million IP addresses in about 37.5 hours time. These are some old statistics. If you built up some Amazon EC2 systems, you could probably do this quicker. So we're looking at about 40 hours for every 2.5 million IP addresses or 2 million IP addresses. That was kind of slow. I'm an impatient hacker. So I said, well, how can I do this quicker? So I came up with some other alternate methods. NTP can be used to identify devices. HD Moore, there was a great post on Carnal Ownage that talked about the NTP vulnerabilities and how every NTP server logs the clients that log into it. We'll show you how to use that to find some embedded systems. DNS Zone Transfers from certain places can give you listings of embedded systems, and I'll show you how that's done. Something I won't go into too much, it's covered in this blog post by GNU Citizen, is you can brute force subdomains. Specifically, a lot of these embedded systems, like wireless routers, will have dynamic DNS providers just for their particular model. So ourlinksys.com is an example of a dynamic DNS provider. They will give you a DNS name tied to an IP address. When your IP address changes, it'll update the record for you. You can go on that domain and try and do DNS subdomain brute forcing. So it's just like password brute forcing, except you're brute forcing DNS with a list of potential host names. So let's talk about NTP. At one time, way back when, Netgear shipped a router with a hard-coded NTP server. So the NTP server that the Netgear products use was hard-coded. To go to the computer science department of the Wisconsin University, after this router started shipping, there was a massive denial of service at the University of Wisconsin, coincidentally, because all these routers started contacting their NTP server. There's a whole article about it that you can go read and read about how they dealt with the traffic and see all kinds of statistics and pretty graphs and stuff. Now, routers still point to it. And how do we know that? Well, because thanks to HD More, we can show that. So what you do is, I did some research and found the NTP server that all the netgear routers were listening to. I used Metasploit and HD Moore's techniques to tell me all of the clients that are probing that NTP server. A lot of them were in DSL and cable modem providers across the world. And I can tell that basically by their domain names gives me kind of a signature that they're DSL providers. What do you want to make a bet that those are netgear routers that haven't updated their firmware? Because the way they fixed this NTP thing was, netgear said, well, we'll just ship new firmware. But not everyone applied the firmware update, so you query the original NTP server, you get a nice listing of systems that not only are likely to be embedded devices, but they're likely to be vulnerable embedded devices that haven't updated their firmware. So that's a little quicker. The other way, this is the quickest way to enumerate embedded systems on the internet, is just to do a good old-fashioned DNS Zone Transfer. And you're like, well, who still allows that? Well, so I was at Source Boston when I first started presenting this little hack right here, and I forgot to blank out the domain that was used, and it got leaked publicly, so this doesn't work anymore. But at one time it did work, and you could do a zone transfer from it, and in about 2.5 seconds you can get 120,000 hosts. If you can find a dynamic DNS provider that has one DNS server anywhere in its chain that's hosting these records that allows a zone transfer, because sometimes someone makes an oops, that means 2.5 seconds, 120,000 potential targets. Sweet. So here's another way to collect. If you want to know, let's say you got this D-Link DIR 655 router at your house, delivered from Newegg, for $89, and you go into its configuration and you look to see which dynamic DNS providers are supported right on the host. A lot of these routers come with, this stuff built right into a menu. So if I find a nice vulnerability on this system, I can go look at these DDNS providers. I can use things like zone transfers. I can do DNS subdomain brute forcing to find potential targets to exploit lots of systems. Scanning the internet reveals a lot of embedded systems. I was actually surprised as to how many were just exposed to the internet without a password, let you log in, and change the person's DNS providers. Now I don't have to worry about uploading a custom configuration or firmware. I can just go change their DNS settings. They're not going to notice it on their host. All their DNS queries can go to a DNS server that I control, and I can start redirecting things. We saw a big hack like this happen in Mexico, where they were hijacking, so they put custom DNS names in people's routers, DNS servers rather, and used it to redirect a popular bank in Mexico to their own website and collect people's financial information. So I don't know if anyone catches this joke, but this was an ISP in Turkey, and I still told Bob to be nice. If you don't understand that, you can see me after. So the Zixel router, this one was great. So it was completely open on the internet. When I browsed to the router, or Bob did, the password was already there. All you had to do was click login. The password was filled in for you. There was no social engineering or anything involved. You just click login and you're into the router. So like I said before, this can get kind of scary. You can start to see where you could build potential botnet around finding these vulnerabilities, creating custom exploits for them, finding these systems very easily, and uploading maybe new firmware, changing the configuration on the routers. So I purchased a WET 610N, which is a wireless bridge. Ethernet on one side, wireless out the other side, because I was too lazy to run cables in my house. So I said, well, let's go through the configuration. It was kind of an exercise for me to look at the security of a particular device. So it went in and it would not let me keep the default password. I had to change the default password of admin to something other than admin. I said, that's awesome. Like, I don't have to give this presentation anymore. I can go do some other research that interests me. The world is a better place. They've finally started smartening up to fix the default password issue, except when you put a new password in, it says, below your settings to your wireless bridge, Linksys highly recommends that you print your settings or write them down. Awesome. Save these settings on a file on my desktop in clear text. So clearly we've still got a little bit of education to do. However, it's better than leaving the password default. This is still better, despite some of the issues with it. It's still better than having a default